One of the long-running projects I've mentioned quite a bit on this channel is VisuORGs, a game show on Discord based on the hit television series Survivor, where the general premise is that a few contestants have to get to the end by voting others out without actually being voted off themselves. So far, we've had 10 seasons of VisuORGs, with the 11th season currently casting. In this video, I'm going to count down every single VisuORGs season ranked from worst to best, being from Season 1 Star Wars to Season 10 Majora's Mask, alongside my co-host Amethyst, who has been editing the trailers since Season 5. We will judge each season based on these criteria: activity, gameplay, cast, story, entertainment, overall twist, and then we will combine all those scores to get our overall score for the season. So just as a general example, if a season had a really good twist, it may lose a few points on the overall score if the gameplay didn't really match up to how good the twist was. One more thing I would like to note is that this is just our personal opinion, and we would like to hear what you guys think depending on what is presented in this video, because as we know, it will depend if you were a spectator for the season, a player for the season, or a host for the season. So everyone's going to see things differently, and we would just like to say, this is our personal opinion, so don't get mad about it, don't get angry about it. This is just how we think of different seasons of the org. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Coming in at number 10, it's to be expected as the first season of the org, but it's Season 1, Star Wars. For a short recap of the results, the season's winner was Camille, with the host favorites being Jerbear, Camille, and Chunkers, with Camille also receiving the fan favorite award. As per any first season of the org, it's bound to be rough around the edges. I believe that while the cast wasn't perfect, nor was the season in itself perfectly executed, I do think that the season has both a mix of ups and downs that can be recognized. While the activity wasn't the best this season, there were definitely some highlights such as Camille, Chunkers, Jerbear, and a few others. Most of the pre-jury ended up being pretty inactive, with Diego being one of the very few exceptions. At the merge, while a little more active overall, still had its highs and lows. Confessionals were used a moderate amount, but by only a select few players, and alliances were really only used near the end. The activity was certainly there, so I definitely can't say it was non-existent, so I'm going to give the activity for this season a nice 3 out of 5. I believe that the gameplay itself for this season was relatively lackluster aside from a few tribal councils, most notably Diego's, Baika's, and Monokuma's. You had Diego getting really cocky in the pre-merge, and then Chunkers flipping on him to send him packing with 2 idols in his pocket. Then you had Baika blowing up on everyone at the merge, and then narrowly going home over Jerbear. You had Chunkers and Benji blindsiding Camille with Monokuma's boot. However, where the gameplay slows down is when Camille obtains his holocron and uses that for the rest of the game, making the tribals pretty predictable. The only exception to this would be Rose convincing Camille to play the holocron on her at the final 5 and save her, only for her to get to the end alongside Camille and nearly beat him at Final Tribal Council. While there were some entertaining tribal councils, most of the gameplay ended up being pretty straightforward, so honestly, the gameplay gets a very mid score of a 2.5 out of 5. In the nicest way possible, I think this cast is insanely forgettable. You have the big names in Camille, Chunkers, Rose, and Jerbear, but then the rest of the cast just isn't memorable otherwise. A lot of the pre-jurors were not very active outside of Diego, and after Baika's blow up at the merge, a lot of the boots were very generic and straightforward aside from the occasional blindside or two. There may have been a few decent names in this cast, but most of the players didn't seem to be familiar about how orgs can be, so the cast for the season gets a very low score of a 2 out of 5. This season's story is very, very lackluster. You have maybe a twinge of a story with Naboo's losing streak at the swap, with Chunkers being dominant on that tribe, and then maybe a little bit of Camille's rise to power with all the holocrons being played every single tribal, but it didn't really make for a coherent and tangible story throughout the entire season, and for that reason, the story for this season gets a very weak rating of a 1 out of 5. The entertainment of the season was overall pretty average. You had a few decent moments such as the Baika Tribal, which looking back, I thought was pretty funny, as well as Arrow's Wheel, which while made for some annoying moments, also made for some funny ones. I do think the straightforward gameplay of the season brings down a lot of the entertainment, specifically with Camille's idols, which, while funny in a sense, made the outcome of the season pretty predictable. That more had to do with not having the best ideas for the idols, which I'll get more into in a bit. But for now, the entertainment category for this season gets also another mid rating of about 2.5 out of 5. Finally, we have the twist. To sum it up in the fastest way possible, I don't know what drugs we were on when we thought the holocrons were a good idea, because it was executed very poorly. The holocrons were essentially upgradable idols in which the player could upgrade them to be a stronger idol using an upgrade card. The bronze holocron could negate a single vote, the silver could negate half the votes, and a gold one was a full idol. Not only did Camille end up finding almost everything, but the 2 item cards that he didn't get, he was given to by both Arrow and Toaster, almost guaranteeing him a shot at Final Tribal Council due to him continually being able to upgrade the holocron to a full idol after using it. Other than the holocrons, there's not much to say about the twists, so for that, the twist this season gets a very weak rating of 1 out of 5. As for the overall rating, the season gets a middle of the road 4 out of 10. This season wasn't incoherently bad by any means. There was just a lot for us as hosts to improve on, as well as getting more experienced players to apply and play in the org. Overall, it was the beginning stepping stone to the org, and that's one of the many reasons that it ranks here at number 10.
Coming in at number 9 is the sequel to Season 1, that being Season 2, Indiana Jones. For a short recap of the results, the season's winner was Rose, with the host favorites being Gumball, Rose, Benji, and Yuna, with Astatine being the fan favorite. As the org got a little more traction coming out of the first season, people got a little more interested in playing the org, which would result in a few more applications and a few more experienced players. This allowed us to sort of test the waters with new twists, which admittedly didn't go perfectly, but it was a visible improvement. This season was more active than Season 1 by a little bit. There were more active players such as Rose, who came from last season, Astatine, Gumball, Deer, hell, even players that got slightly earlier boots such as Liv and Kana. The pre-jury was still pretty inactive for the most part, despite there being more uses of confessionals, especially from players who made the merge. There were still GOATs this season, but not as much as there were in Season 1. The activity in the Alliance chats was still pretty decent, making it an improvement in activity from Season 1, but not by a huge amount. So for that, the activity gets a pretty decent 3.5 out of 5. While this season didn't offer riveting gameplay, it's important to note that there were a few instances of pretty solid and concrete gameplay, most notably with Aura's boot, Liv's boot being a close vote, Yuna going home with a single vote from Astatine, and Rose single-handedly causing the majority alliance to crumble with her winning a shit ton of immunities. Rose's FTC is also something to note, as she would pick apart Astatine and Gumball's games to come out on top in a 5-2-2 vote. Not every single tribal was exciting, as most of them just had one target, and everyone just kind of stick to that. The gameplay wasn't bad, but not super exciting, leading to this section to get an okay rating of a 3 out of 5. I think this cast is a small step up from Season 1's. With people more comfortable and experienced with playing orgs this season, as well as the chemistry being fairly solid, aside from Liv and Shelby, but that's not something we're diving into. A few bigger names were present, as mentioned earlier, but I would still argue that the majority of pre-jurors and a few jurors were pretty forgettable, leading to this cast to be better than the season before it, but not a huge step up. So for that, it gets an okay 3 out of 5. I think despite what the season has in casting gameplay, it ultimately lacks in story and memorability. This time, Miriela Guda is the new Naboo of the season, where it doesn't lose every challenge, but ends up going to Tribal 3 times, ending in the tribe having only 3 people on it, leading up to Aura's boot from a coin that Panda flipped. There was also Liv's villain arc after Shelby's tribal, despite Liv only getting 10th. As well as Rose actually finding the idol and winning 5 immunities total 4 from the final 8 onwards. And there was also the majority alliance between Gumball, Kala, Astatine, Yuna, and Lily. Aside from that, there's not really much to say about the season regarding its story. Most of the tribals ended up being pretty straightforward. I couldn't even tell you what happened in most of them. While FTC was alright, it's not enough to save the story from a poor rating of a 1.5 out of 5. I think the season was more entertaining than the last by a few standards. For one, the more memorable names brought a lot to the table with how they played and offered up various winning potential. You had Deer doing very well in the pre-merge, even buying Nitro for Shelby to gain her trust, Liv being the villain against Shelby, Astatine and Gumball having social connections, and Rose winning out to get to FTC amidst a large majority alliance. However, when it's only 3 to 4 events that make a season entertaining, that's where points have to be docked off, leaving the season to get an okay entertainment rating of 3 out of 5. Finally, we have the twist. And while it was better than Season 1's level of pure bullshit, it had its own problems too, to a slightly lesser extent, but problems nonetheless. The tribes would all send someone to exile, which went in rotation with a few advantages, which sounds interesting in concept, but the exiles ended up being way too hard, resulting in little impact on the game. Rose was the only person to find the idol from the maze, but that was at the end of the game after numerous unsuccessful attempts of a long, luck-based maze where you could blindly choose to go left or right. Due to the lack of impact on the game due to the really hard difficulty, the twist gets a poor rating of a 2 out of 5. Overall, this season gets a slight increase of a rating of a 5.3 out of 10. The season showed multiple improvements in not only the hosting, the twists, and the gameplay as well. It showed a lot of promise for future seasons of the org, having a multitude of positive factors, but that doesn't come with a few negatives such as the twist being a little difficult, the gameplay itself being boring at times, and the story being close to non-existent, much like the season's predecessor. However, it was an improvement from Season 1, albeit not by much, but that's why it ranks here at number 9. Coming in at number 8 is the season right after All-Stars and the one that kicked off Generation 2, Season 7, Harry Potter. This season's winner was Akashi, with host favorites being Fwogcarf, Penguin, and Felt, and Pi being the fan favorite. Coming right out of our first All-Star season of the org, there were pretty high expectations for the following seasons right after. Unfortunately, Season 7 definitely did not live up to the hype as much as people thought it would, due to the cast being lackluster, as well as the overarching twist being overly intimidating and slightly difficult depending on the experience of the players. The activity of the season had its highs and lows for the most part. There were the players who were about as active as some of the players from Season 5 and Season 6, including Maddie, Scarecrow, Pi, Penguin, Akashi, and Fwogcarf. However, there were also extremely inactive players, such as Lucas, as well as Kaiko, to some extent, who didn't really use her confessional at all for most of the pre-merge, as well as there being 3 people who essentially asked to be voted off at their tribal. Chats were used a lot differently due to the twists, which ended up resulting in there being a lot more VCs, especially in the first cycle, as well as most of the merge. Overall, the activity had very high highs and very low lows, compounding to a pretty decent score of a 3.5 out of 5. The gameplay this season definitely had to be majorly altered to cater to this season's twist. In the pre-merge, the only significant amount of gameplay was Maddie's pre-gaming with Lucas and Kaiko, attempting to get both of them to the jury for free votes, which could come at the expense of Panini's blind side. However, the merge definitely improves this section with Noxious Tribal, Felt's RNG self-vote out, Rosebuddy's blind side, and then Penguin's, Pi's, and Kaiko's boot following shortly right after. This would ultimately see both Scarecrow and Akashi at FTC, where Akashi would deliver a good enough speech to prove that his game was better than Scarecrow's, who had pissed off quite a few people by arguably using the twist to their benefit. While some gameplay wasn't great this season, there was a lot to make up for it, which is why this season gets a nice middle rating of a 3.5 out of 5. Despite some pretty stacked applications, as well as the newbies and people not as familiar with orgs not doing too badly, this might be the season with arguably the worst cast chemistry out of all the seasons. I think that the cast being put together would have worked fine in concept, but the execution did not work at all. There were a lot of arguments of the season that got pretty personal, to the point where one person actually had to walk because of that. Also, as mentioned earlier, 3 people asked to be voted off in the pre-merge, which, while maybe a result of unfortunate timing, it did not help the quality of the season one bit. One of the biggest problems with the cast was how Maddie tried to keep both Lucas and Kaiko in due to a pregame, as well as there being a pretty decent amount of players who, while moderately active, didn't really make a whole lot of moves. For that, I'm unfortunately going to have to give the cast of this season a poor 1.5 out of 5. There may not have been a whole lot of story in the pre-merge, however, the merge is definitely where it picked up a lot more. You had the constant battle between Maddie and Scarecrow and Akashi's infamous home to the Black Lake chat. You had some smaller stories with Felt's RNG self-vote, Penguin getting the idol and then going home with it after wasting his pocket sneakoscope he had found as well, Pine not using both bludgers to tie the vote, Akashi idling Kaiko, and then Akashi nearly sweeping the entire jury at FTC. While it's not the most coherent story ever, there at least was some form of it present as versus the previous 2 seasons on this ranking. For that, I have to give the story in this season a solid 3.5 out of 5. This season has a lot of highs and lows as far as the entertainment goes, but I feel as though there was a lot more times where we personally got a lot more annoyed with this season than excited about the tribals. You had the pre-jury tribals where most of them were either boring or annoying. 3 people asked to be voted off, 2 people were inactive, 1 person was targeted based on their time zone, and 1 person got out due to a pregame from Maddie that kept Lucas in even though he's supposed to go home, and Maddie wasn't even at that tribal, which was really frustrating. You had a few decent merge moments such as Felt's RNG self-vote, which was funny, as well as some decent moves here and there with the Rose Buddy vote out, but then you also had the feud between Maddie and Scarecrow, which ended up getting way too personal and really hindered the enjoyment of the season. I also got pretty fed up with the cast complaining about the challenges again, which in hindsight sounds like a nitpick, but it got pretty annoying pretty quickly. This could have been a really entertaining season, but there were a lot of boring and annoying parts about it, which I have to admit, they outweigh the fun moments. So for that, I'm going to give the entertainment a 2 out of 5. This season's twist most arguably represents what the Survivor show entails as a whole, with the players needing to move from chat to talk to people, much like people going from one person to another in the show. However, this was something that brought a fair amount of complaints and quite a bit of confusion, especially for newcomers to orgs like Sugar and Flogcarf. It would start pretty engaging, but later on, by around the final 8, it would start taking a toll on people later on. Maddie and Scarecrow were the only ones really actively moving around. Everyone else just kind of stuck to one chat. I don't think the twist itself was bad, but I think it falls flat with this cast. However, with a much more active cast, the twist would have worked phenomenally. I think that lands the twist itself with a rating of 4 out of 5, only really losing a point because of the cast that it was given. Overall, the season really did not age well looking back on it, even though at the time it was happening, I think we actively hated it more. While it wasn't coherently dull like the first 2 seasons were, the cast and the twist did not work very well with each other, causing quite a few problems throughout the season's duration. It did have some favorable moments as mentioned before, but the negatives definitely impacted the positives, resulting in the season losing a lot of potential it could have had, putting it at a decent 6 out of 10 in the 8th spot on this ranking. It's not something we actively hate, but it's not the first season we think of.
Coming in at number 7 is the season right after Season 2, Season 3, Back to the Future. This season's winner was Colin, while the host favorites were Colin, Dallas, and Hayden, with the fan favorite being Kana. While there were slightly fewer applicants this time around than in Season 2, this is where I felt the quality of the org started to improve drastically. It had a lot more going for it than the first 2 seasons and ended up being pretty okay, despite some noticeable issues still lingering around. Amy personally used to think Season 2 was better than Season 3, but I think Season 3 has a much more interesting story as well as a lot more notable tribal councils. The activity for the most part was pretty average. You had some highlights such as Colin, Dallas, Kana, and Jake, as well as Jet and Mina to some extent. The Preacher actually ended up being better too. Yeah, some of the boots such as Hayden and High resulted in Baika meta-targeting from SSS and Fanviver, but about half the pre-merge had some pretty good players. What does hurt the activity a bit is some of the repercussions the metagaming had, because about half the players who made the merge were more on the inactive side, most notably 2 of them. The overall activity ended up being pretty mixed, but around the same level as Season 2. So for that, the activity for the season gets a 3.5 out of 5. I think while the cast didn't offer an insane amount of gameplay, there were definitely some notable moments. We got a little bit of poor gameplay to start off with Baika's metagaming shenanigans early into the season, as well as most of the vote-offs in general being pretty straightforward. We did have some really good moves using the season's shop twist. This is most notably seen with XP's boot, with both XP and Dallas using Pepsi to have a little mini war at that tribal council, and the following tribal at the merge of both Jet and Colin playing Pepsi's on Colin to send Chunkers home in a whopping 4 to 2.72 vote. Later on in the season, we had Dallas's blindside on Will as well as Dallas's idle play sending Mina home with only a 68th of a vote. I think while the gameplay this season did mostly rely on the season's twist, some gameplay is better than none at all, putting the gameplay for the season at a solid 3.5 out of 5. Now, while there was a fair amount of good gameplay, as well as a decent amount of activity, that doesn't come without its repercussions. Much like Season 7's cast, the chemistry between the players just wasn't there. This is most notably present with both Baika just being present, as well as Naito later being revealed to be a cheater. It didn't help that we had a record amount of quits and medevacs in this season, with Brianna, Naito, and Jake all being involved in it. It ultimately soured the cast and doesn't make them out to be all that memorable. However, we did have some ups with Colin, Jake, Jet, Kana, Mina, and Dallas all being on the cast and bringing a lot to the season overall. Even though we had some good players on this cast, ultimately a lot of the cast is forgettable, leaving the season's cast with a rating of 2 out of 5. Now, arguably, this season would be a lot lower if not for the story of the season. This is probably debatable, but I'd argue that this season's story was entirely focused on Colin's journey throughout the season. Colin was always involved in something throughout the entire game, from the start of Aquatania allying with Baika to being at the very bottom of the merge and pulling off the season's flashiest play with his closest ally Jet, to being in a complete power position after Will's blindside. However, amidst following Colin's story throughout the entire season, it did make for a predictable ending after Dallas went home. It was certain that Colin had the win in the bag, but since this season is the first season on this ranking to actually have a proper story, and arguably carrying the season because of it, this season's story gets a good, solid score of 4 out of 5. This season was fairly entertaining throughout, with there being some highs and lows again, some of the highs being the Pepsi plays, as well as arguably Baika being in a power position on the Aquatania tribe, while some of the lows being that there were a few people that didn't really use their confessional at all, Derek, and didn't make any moves either, also Derek, and Naito dropping hints that he was a cheater well before he got pulled from the game. Overall, it was more entertaining than the past few seasons, but much like the past few seasons, it had its high points and low points, so in general, this season's entertainment gets a solid 3 out of 5. This season's twist revolved around an item shop. The players would need to find coins hidden around the server to be able to purchase items needed to craft advantages. Certain advantages might have needed other items to craft it, but if the player had enough for the item, they were told the recipe for it. Overall, it went smoothly, until people figured out that the Pepsis were extremely cheap and very busted. Pepsis could negate 33% of the votes on a player, meaning if a player or a few players had 3 of them, it was basically an idol for a very cheap amount of supplies. This would cause everything else in the shop to practically get ignored, and people would only craft the Pepsis. Now, did it make for some good gameplay? Yes. Did it get boring seeing a Pepsi after every tribal? Yes. Did we intend for this to happen? Absolutely not. This twist, while not perfect, still allowed the season to perform well and gave us some good moments with it. For that, this season's twist gets a 3 out of 5. Overall, this season was pretty good. It was better than we expected it to go initially. There was a lot more to it than both Season 1 and Season 2, with there being more interesting moves, a better story, a more chaotic twist that wasn't complete bullshit or too hard, even if it didn't work the way we intended it to initially. The activity was about the same as the previous season, so there wasn't much of an improvement there. I think this cast was a bit of a downgrade because some of the better players got out early, which resulted in there being a lot of inactives at the merge, making some of the cast pretty forgettable for the most part. I think this season ended up being a noticeable improvement from our first 2 seasons, even despite its numerous issues. So for that, it gets a fairly decent score of a 6.3 out of 10, putting it here at the number 7 spot.
Coming in at number 6 is the last season that happened in 2021, Season 4, The Matrix. This season's winner was Sled, with the host favorites being Sled, Luke, Joy, and Rex, with the fan favorite also being Sled. So Season 4 was originally going to be Jurassic Park. We decided to change the theme and make it The Matrix after a last-second idea from Raven. This season was actually pretty good. The players were a noticeable improvement from Season 3, and our hosting ended up being a lot better as well, with submission channels finally being added to prevent knowing challenge scores or voting ahead of time with an alt. We took the season a lot more seriously than our past few seasons, and I think that benefited the quality of the season significantly, with a lot less issues this time around. There were also some visual changes such as a better logo with actual shading and drop shadows, and season art from Kana. This was the most active season up to this point, way better than our past 3 seasons. The pre-merge ended up being pretty mediocre, as per usual, with most of the boots being either pretty inactive and obvious targets for those rounds, with a few exceptions of course, which I'll get more into later. The merge, however, more than made up for that. As more people used their confessionals and alliance chats, hell, there were even some people who became a lot more creative with their confessional channels, most notably Jet and Luke. Alliance chats were used more as well, with there being more conversations happening, helped by the cast, which I'll talk about later. Overall, good activity, so it gets a 4 out of 5. There may not have been as many crazy moves with a lot of advantages like in Season 3, but I think this season had a lot more players who just overall played better. Yeah, the pre-merge wasn't the best as far as moves go, but by the final 9, you could argue that it was anyone's game. Sled was the winner of the season and ended up getting to the end with a really good physical and strategic game. Luke was more of a villainous player than what we've seen in any previous season, along with good social connections as well as good strategy. Marissa, Mina, and Jet had all really good social games, way better than all of their previous seasons and some of the best in the season. Overall, a lot more stacked of a cast in terms of gameplay. Not as many moves were made, but there were more players with a winning strategy, so for that, the gameplay gets a 4 out of 5. This season had a pretty good cast. Damn good. Much better than past few seasons. I don't think there was any bad blood between the players at all, and some of the conversations I watched between the players were pretty interesting. I love watching Luke spawns with Jet, Artemis, and Jacoby. Like, Jacoby and Luke had this plan for Jacoby's birthday, which unfortunately never ended up happening because Jacoby got pre-jury. But there were also other players I wouldn't expect to see together, and it actually made the season better. Also, there was just more winning gameplays that made the season competitive, but in a good way. This was just overall a really chill season, and one that I had a lot of fun watching, with not as many big names, but more names that got along well with each other. So for that, this season's cast gets a 4 out of 5. Now, here's where some of the downsides of the season come into play, because there wasn't really that much of a story. Not that it was bad, it just wasn't really that memorable. While there were a lot of winner picks in the merge, it was never really that hard for Sled to make it to the end. At least not compared to Colin, who almost went home in the final 13 tribal in season 3. There was the whole weak tribe going to tribal over and over again trope from previous seasons, returning in season 4 with Fuharita, but that was to a lesser extent, and they just had more inactivity than going to tribal over and over, making the tribe just pretty uninteresting overall. You could also argue that the Yellow Pill had some story as well, with it affecting Luke, Mello, and Mina by restricting the amount of messages they can send in most alliances per day, but that was less story and more just an annoyance. There were some interesting things like Henki winning his way back into the game twice, only to get medevaced on his own accord. So, not much too special. There's nothing really wrong with Season 4's story, but there's nothing really right either. So for that, it gets an okay 3 out of 5. This season was pretty decently entertaining. There was never a dull moment with any of the people who made FTC, and some of the players had a chaotic attitude, but chill at the same time, making there never really being a point where I hated watching the season. Some of the tribals were sort of straightforward though, especially in the pre-jury, where the vote outs were either predictable, or if they weren't predictable, then they just had a pretty obvious reason early on. For example, Vakadal's tribal, where he got out for abstaining in the challenge. Overall, there was never really a point that I didn't like watching the season, even if it wasn't the most interesting all the time. So the entertainment gets a pretty decent 3.5 out of 5. Lastly is the twist, and there were two. One of them was okay, the other one was kind of shitty. First up was the Cyber Realm, which was basically the redemption island of the season, and you basically had to get back into the game by beating one other player in a challenge for a few rounds. For the most part, I think it worked out pretty good. Roily managed to get his way back in from the pre-jury and ended up getting 10th, while Henki came back twice, even beating Kashino, who was having a pretty good run until he went up against Henki. And then Henki got medevaced, so the twist didn't really impact the game as much as I wished it did. Then there was the pills from the Final 12 challenge. They sucked. The red pill, which reduced challenge scores, barely had an impact. The green pill, which randomized for advantages for some of the players, was okay, but hardly affected the game after the first 3 tribals. And then the yellow pill, which reduced total messages in every alliance chat, except for 2 of them, down to 5 messages, ended up being really frustrating and way worse than I intended. Overall, not the best twists. Most of them had potential, but they fell flat, albeit not as bad as Season 1 or Season 2, so I think it's fair to give this twist an average 2.5 out of 5. Overall, this season ended up being pretty good. It might not be as good as I initially remember it being, at least compared to later seasons, but it was a pretty active season with decent gameplay and a really good cast that got along very well. Like past seasons, the twist didn't really work out the way we intended. You've probably noticed a common trend there. That's not fixed until season 6. This is the first time we actually took the org more seriously, and it shows. A good way to end off 2021, and one of the biggest stepping stones for both the org quality and us as hosts. So for that, this season gets a pretty good 6.8 out of 10 at the number 6 spot.
Breaking the top 5 is our All-Star season, Season 6, Pixar. This season's winner was Deer, while the host favorites were Jake and Gumball, with the fan favorite being Camille. Going into this season, there was a ton of hype to see how this cast would turn out, especially after the massive success that Season 5 was. We really wanted to have 5 representatives for each respective season leading up to that point, but ultimately that would cause more problems than help. But the season would still end up going extremely smoothly, even despite that, as well as a few bumps in the road toward the end of the season. As to be expected from an All-Stars cast, the activity for this season was extremely high. It says something when the first boot in Benji was not inactive at all when he had gotten booted. The activity would be retained by almost all of the cast members minus a few throughout the entire season, and even those that weren't 100% present had gotten booted by the time the merge rolled around. From the merge onwards, each vote was extremely active, and due to that said activity, it made for more strategic decisions and ideas. This would also play into the season's final tribal council, but more on that later. Season 6 deserves a solid 4.5 out of 5 for the rating on activity, but that's to be expected from an All-Stars cast as said previously. I think even though the activity was very high, the gameplay, while not bad in the slightest, was just very generic and straightforward, and it wasn't really too exciting looking back on it now. You can mainly pinpoint Rose's idle play on Acetine in the early merge as something of note, but otherwise, it was mainly the biggest threat at the time, or just the first name that was suggested. While the gameplay could be worse, this season offered a lot of straightforward votes as given by the theme of All-Stars. For that reason, the gameplay earns itself a solid 3.5 out of 5. This was touched on a little earlier in the short season introduction, but we attempted to get 5 players from each previous season for it to be a battle of the seasons type of All-Stars. But this would ultimately fall extremely flat as a lot of people we had hoped to get from Season 5 would ultimately decline, leaving us to scramble around to try to grab people for the season. This would ultimately leave us shuffling around for people a lot, and it made for some conflicts. This was mainly notable in the pre-gaming done pre-season with Rose, Camille, Mello, and Deer making a little joke-type deal to get everyone to the final 8 to do a dare of some sort. This ultimately would piss off a few people, most notably Dallas. While I do think the cast was generally good, and they got along for the most part, it was mainly towards the end after Gamehead had gotten mad at both Jake and Deer at the final 9. I think this cast definitely stressed each other out, as there would be 2 walks at the final 6 and final 4 for stress-related reasons, and while both are completely valid, it does kind of say something about the cast if it's reaching that point. While I think this was a solid cast, we did have some hiccups in getting players and also them playing in the season, leading to the cast for the season to get a 3.5 out of 5. In an All-Star season, there is usually a story revolving around a few of the players, and luckily for us, there most definitely was one here. This season's story mainly followed 3 of the most influential players in Camille, Jake, and Deer. Camille was looking for a way to prove himself after his win was clouded by the Holocron in Season 1, and both Jake and Deer had been medevacs in their debut seasons, so they also had something that they truly wanted to prove. Camille would get his way vote-wise for a majority of the season, while Jake and Deer ultimately would play much more aggressively and piss off a few more people, ultimately allowing them to get to the end and truly have an amazing clash at Final Tribal Council. I do think the story got put to a screeching halt with the 2 quits at the Final 6 and Final 4. Final Tribal Council would prove to be a great way for that story to pick right back up, with it coming in a tie of a 4-4-3 vote. The original Forerunner in Switch would end up getting 3rd and lay the final vote to declare one of the 2 beasts at Tribal Council the winner, which ultimately would be Deer. While I arguably do think that Jake winning would have made the season's story much stronger, the season still holds up really well, with Deer ultimately being seen as the person who would get 3rd originally, but would completely flip it around to make them the victor. I think that the season's story is definitely something to remember. It did have its rough patches, but ultimately definitely had a good ending, and also had the potential to have a phenomenal one as well. For that, this season's story gets a solid 4 out of 5. What comes with a good story? I think it's the entertainment along the way. While the gameplay in itself was pretty standard and straightforward, this cast was very entertaining throughout all of it. You had the main titans of the season in Jake, Deer, and Camille, always providing everyone with insight into their games as well as plentiful enjoyable moments, most notably the rock discussion between Camille and Jake right before the final 5 vote, as well as Sasuke's reaction to getting idled out 2 for 2 times in this org's history in back-to-back seasons. I really did love watching the final few votes of the season and the final tribal council that followed it. You could really tell that the 3 at Final Tribal Council wanted this win and truly wanted to fight for it every step of the way. The vote tying was a perfect way to continue the clash, with Switch pulling the win out for dear at the end of the day. I think while on the vote side of the season not being so entertaining, the plentiful good moments to look back on definitely make it worthwhile. For that reason, the entertainment this season gets a strong 4 out of 5. Honestly, as the person who single-handedly crafted and came up with this twist, I think it was pretty good. It was a simple idol grid in which the players got to guess a coordinate each episode to see if a piece of the season's idol was in that coordinate. The idol was comprised of 5 pieces from the past 5 seasons' idols used by past players. Camilla and Rose would ultimately easily construct the idol fairly quickly, and the idol would be used correctly on Acetine to idol out Sasuke at the merge. While the twist wasn't anything huge, it definitely served its purpose well enough, and for that, this twist gets a solid 3.5 out of 5. All in all, looking back on the season, it actually was a lot better than I remembered it at the time of its running. You had a pretty decent all-star cast that made the game extremely eventful and worthwhile to watch, a solid story for a few of the players, and a pretty solid twist alongside it. This season is definitely a good season to look back on and remember, and while it wasn't a perfect or godly all-star season, it definitely was a great way to cap off the first generation of the org up to that point. For being the number 5 ranking on this list, this season gets a very nice 7.7 out of 10. Coming up at the number 4 spot is our last season of 2022, Season 9, It. This season's winner was DK, and the host favorites were DK, Storm, and Kaz, while Kaz also was the fan favorite of the season. Coming out of Season 8 being the new best season of the org to date, Season 9 had people's eyes on it, especially considering it was the second full newbie season that we had been doing in the second generation of the org, and to be honest, while it wasn't as high of a caliber as Season 8 or Season 5, it definitely was our best newbie season to date, which wasn't too hard to top, considering our past ones had been Season 1 and Season 7 respectively. For a fairly small cast, the season's activity was actually really high. Even the first 4 Sakayan members who went home were actually not inactive at all. Everyone used their confessional a pretty good amount, with some people even doing video confessionals this time around. Almost nobody was voted out for being inactive, which really helped a lot of the moves that were made, and it also helped improve the entertainment of the season for this reason. Even if it wasn't as big of a scale as some of the previous seasons, the activity was pretty solid all around from nearly all of the cast members, and nobody really stuck out as an outlier for that reason. So for that, this season's activity gets a solid 4 out of 5. I think while the gameplay was nothing insanely superb, there were definitely a few notable moments throughout the season where the gameplay shined, and where it didn't shine so much. For starters, we had the absolute collapse of the Sakayan tribe, now coined Sakayan, in which they would lose all 4 of the pre-merge challenges. Now, this normally would just be something to note and we'd move on, but at each and every single one of their tribal councils, they'd vote off somebody else for a completely different reason each time. Drew would go for being inactive compared to everyone else, JJ would be blindsided because of a fear of a swap, Total would be voted out for bombing the challenge, and Dean would be the last to go because he wanted to force rocks between the final 3 people on the tribe. This would begin the season's legacy of being known as the Gabon season of the org. After a few more boots, we see Kaz completely control the merge tribe and taking out Echo in quite the blindside in fear of a pagonging of his OG tribe. At the D-merge, we get to see Luke flip Damien back and forth between his old and new allies. At the remerge, we see Jacob and Cyber completely throw their games out the window with how far can you go, leading to some very questionable tribals right after. Damien would get blindsided by DK, Storm, and Robert to kick off the remerge, and then Robert would save Kaz, who was the biggest threat by this point, by flipping on everyone to send Cyber packing. Robert would then flip again to send Luke packing with an idol in their pocket, which would then cause Storm to flip on DK and Robert by sending Jacob home instead of Kaz. Kaz would just surf on by between all of this flipping. Ultimately, Kaz would go home at the Final 4, and the Final Tribal Council would prove to be a fun Final Tribal Council to watch, with DK pointing out errors in Storm and Robert's speeches, and it would net him the win at the end of the day. There were so many good moves as well as some very, very questionable moves this season, truly making it feel like Survivor Gabon all over again, but in a much more memorable fashion. For that reason, the gameplay this season gets a solid 4 out of 5. Once again, like previous seasons, this season's cast would prove to be really good. So good to the point where I can't really think of anything wrong with it. It might honestly just be one of the best casts we've ever had. Not only were all three tribes stacked from the get-go, despite maybe one or two duds, but both the pre-merge and the merge had mostly really good players, especially DK, Kaz, Luke, Storm, Damien, Robert, and Cybert. We had the tribe of Sakayan that proved to us that the dynamic could constantly be changing each vote, and then the tribe of Vode getting pagonged a bit at the start of the merge, the blindside of Echo to change that, the demerge with the moves made there, and then the cast fighting to make moves from the remerge onwards with several, and sometimes questionable, blindsides back to back to back. The final three all put up a huge fight at the end of the day, leading to a very memorable final tribal council with DK pulling the win out. This cast was definitely memorable and gave us a great season to look back on, netting the cast for the season to get a perfect 5 out of 5. I think this season could be argued to be the third season to really have a story going on at all times throughout the season. First, we had the story of the doomed Sakayan tribe and their inability to be a functioning tribe and win a single challenge, with only Cyber and BK making it to the merge after losing 4 challenges in a row. Starting at the merge, we saw Kaz and Damien really start to pull strings and make their names known in the game, with Damien going on to flip back and forth at the demerge, but getting voted out at the remerge, and Kaz orchestrating the Echo blindside, and then going on to be the biggest threat at the remerge, surviving 4 tribal councils longer than he should have, only for DK to take Kaz's spot after he was voted off at the final 4, being the star in the forerunner at final tribal council, concluding the story with his victory. While it is less complicated of a story than Season 6 and Season 3 were, I think that the story always had someone new picking up from where someone else left off, really making it a tangible and coherent story all the way throughout the season, giving the story of the season a really solid 4.5 out of 5. This season's entertainment was pretty consistent all the way throughout the entire season. The early events on Sakayan definitely had everyone questioning if they were single-handedly the worst tribe in the org's entire history. Spoiler alert, they were. Which this would also keep us hooked on to who would be going home every single tribal. Then we had the early merge with Echo's blindside orchestrated by Kaz, then the demerge with Damien's constant flipping, leading into the remerge. I'd also argue that this is definitely the peak of the entire season. With the votes being so insanely messy due to how far can you go, it led to a ton of unpredictable tribals with Damien, Cybers, Luke's, and Jacobs all being half a vote to 1 vote apart. This also set up the end of the game to be extremely entertaining with everyone's constant flipping, allowing the biggest threat in Kaz to somehow make it to the final 4. With Kaz going at 4, the final tribal council would prove to be entertaining, with all 3 finalists arguing about their different approaches to the game, with DK debunking the hell out of both Storm and Robert's speeches. This would lead the season to have a satisfying ending with DK winning in a 4-2-1 vote. This season had a ton of notable and entertaining moments, and it was definitely easy to remember, leading the entertainment of the season to get a solid 4 out of 5. The primary twist of the season was the bounties, in which each player would get another player as their bounty should they go to tribal council. If the player successfully got their bounty out, they would choose anyone to penalize with half a vote at their next tribal council. This part of the twist ultimately would lead to a very fun merge, with the entirety of Vode only having half a vote due to everyone targeting them with the bounties, which would ultimately lead to Echo's blindside later on. The other part of this twist was the Storm Drain twist, which was a gamble game in which the players would try to grab the paper boat going down the stream. Depending on how many players had picked before the next player, the player would either miss it, get it, or their arm would be ripped off by Pennywise, being that they just lost their vote. Robert would get the extra vote that the boat held, and it was used to vote off Echo and his blindside. The twist worked as some people lost their vote and some people didn't get anything, but it didn't really have a major impact on the season as a whole, while the bounties definitely did. For that reason, the twist of the season get a nice 4 out of 5. Overall, this season was very enjoyable. It's definitely a memorable season by all means and definitely holds true to its number 4 spot on this list. It had a great cast, a great twist, great entertainment, and a great outcome as a whole. It definitely gave the all newbie seasons a much stronger light as before the season. Season 7 and Season 1 were the only all newbie seasons, and as you could probably tell by this list already, those weren't all that great in comparison. For the last season before the revamp of the org, it definitely was a great way to end the all-movie era of the org. I think while this season was great in its own rights, the next few seasons just do everything that Season 9 did to an even better extent. With the number 4 spot on this list, Season 9 gets a very strong 8.5 out of 10.
Edging its way into the top 3, we have the season right before All-Stars and our first season of 2022, Season 5, Justice League. This season's winner was Game Ed, with host favorites being Bilger, Switch, Evelyn, Emma, and Game Ed, with the fan favorite being Funky. Being the second season with art, the first season with a trailer, and a Blood vs. Water season where you could apply with a partner, there was a lot of hype going into this season, with there being about 70 applicants, most of which were really good. Now, unlike Season 6, which I'd argue wasn't really as good as we were planning, this season actually lived up to the hype to become the best season of the org for a while. There were some low points, but there were also loads of highs, and the season ended up becoming very exciting because of that. There was not a single person who was inactive. Even some of the pre-jurors were some of the most active we've ever had, while the merges activity was absolutely insane. Look at Game End's 40,000 messages. So many people use their confessional on a regular basis. So many people were active in their alliance chats every day. And we even had duo chats, which, while some of them may not have lasted the longest, they were used pretty frequently and especially came vital in some game moves and advantage findings, which I'll dive more into later. Every pre-merge and merge tribal was really active, and most of them required a lot of strategies or had some pretty crazy ability plays happen, and the activity really benefits from the cast. It's hard to just top, how much everyone was online in the season. There was almost never a dull moment regarding the activity, so for that, the activity gets a perfect 5 out of 5. This season had some stellar gameplay. To first start off, with moves being made left and right from the get-go, even as early as Estelle's boot, and of course, the infamous Superman tribal. This tribal was absolutely insane. For a bit of context, Bilger told Rose to play his fake idol he gave her in order for him to get the real one. So then Bilger gives his idol to Matthew, who then gives it to Emma for the Final 9 tribal, where she's about to get voted off. Emma had 8 votes against her, so the tribal was originally going to be on Redfine, and he actually got voted off. But then he played his Superman ability that works like a super idol, basically allowing him to get a second life in the game and come back. So tribal restarts, and Derek mistakenly says something about Game End being shady, so Derek ends up being voted off instead. I could go on and on about that tribal, but there were quite a few swap screws as well, most notably with Henke and Scott's boots. At the merge, we had the simple boots in both Colby and Evelyn, and then we just get hit by a truck with Crazy's blindside. We the Fucked 4 was made with Funky, Joy, Sasuke, and Switch completely dominating the game afterwards. The blindsides just continue to pile up, with Matthew, Rose, and Lizard's blindsides. Even after those had settled down, we had Joy intentionally using Sasuke's abilities to negate his own debuff with his, and then just idling Sasuke out right afterward. We also had a lot of alliances get made very early on and get far into the game, and even the much later ones like We the Fucked 4 thrived very late into the season, only being thwarted by Game End's challenge prowess. FTC would prove to be a massive show in gameplay, with Switch's stellar under-the-radar game versus Game End's flashy and dominant game, which would ultimately come down to a tie, with Emma giving the win to Game End due to her social ties with her. This season's gameplay was most definitely not forgettable, and this season holds a ton of memorable tribals because of it. And for that, the gameplay this season gets a very solid 4.5 out of 5. The cast was fairly solid all around. All of them range from moderately active to online 24/7, and we had a broad pool of players in the season. Some of the highlights from the season include Game End, Switch, Funky, Joy, Bilger, Sasuke, Rose, Emma, Matthew, and Evelyn. Both tribes were stacked as hell, and neither of them were unbalanced. They won and lost the challenges at the exact same amount of times, and even during the swap, Chiramtis barely went to tribal more times than Nopert, with Listanta never going to travel, there were way more video confessionals and way more entertaining moments from the cast this season than any prior. Everyone wanted to win this season. So, with how good of a cast we've had so far, where does it fall short? I feel like this cast usually got a little more hot headed in general, not just with each other, but also with some of the hosts as well. While it was mostly understandable as to why, there were a couple of moments where I really think some of the cast was a result of the season's low points, such as everyone's reaction to the Superman tribal, which went from surprising to targeting us for it pretty quickly. I'm not saying it was a bad tribal, far from that actually, and the outcome of that tribal far overshadows some of the backlash we got from it, but the complaining about the challenges and the twists became a lot more excessive than necessary, and it became a recurring theme for not just this season, but also for season 7 and arguably season 6. Unlike those two seasons though, the season managed to stay engaging enough to where the positives far outweigh the negatives of the cast, even if the negatives were still relevant. So for that, I'm going to give this cast a pretty good 4 out of 5. It may not have been the best cast, but it was a good one. This season's story was really solid for a season being done a year ago. I would argue that the pre-merge was centered around the 4 main org players, that being Emma, Bilger, Matthew, and Frog. While Frog got voted out extremely early, Emma, Matthew, and Bilger all worked together and got Bilger's idol that Rose helped him get to Emma, who was going to be voted off next, only for her to idle and cause Redfine to reverse the entire tribal with his Superman ability. From here on out, those 3 were able to solidify themselves extremely well in the game and even got to pull off arguably one of the biggest moves in the season at the merge with Crazy's Blindside. However, I think that's exactly where the story ended, and the new story emerged with the best alliance of the org's history to date, We the Fucked Four. Being the 4 on the bottom after Crazy's Blindside, Funky, Switch, Sasuke, and Joy all banded together to eliminate those that had gone against them. This would result in pure dominance with Matthew, Rose, Lizard, and Bilger all going afterward because of their control. However, all things must come to an end, and that alliance did when Gay Men started completely challenge beasting immunities, resulting in Funky, Sasuke, and Joy all going back to back. This would result in Gay Men and Switch clashing at FTC with both of their stories in the season. Ultimately, the vote would tie, and Gay Men's close ally in Emma would hand her the win, pushing Gay Men's dominant story on top of Switch's under the radar story. I think that this season really held an even story all around, and it wasn't solely centered on a few individuals. It almost felt like a genuine novel with it being split into chapters, and I think that's what makes the season extremely memorable and coherent as a result, leading this season's story to be a perfect 5 out of 5. If it wasn't already obvious in the previous sections, I thought this season was very entertaining. You had the whole fiasco with the early idle play on Emma, the Superman tribal, Rip Derek, and the merge being unified to begin with, only to devolve into the chaos that the repeated blindsides back and forth from Crazy Tribal onwards, whether it be from the main org players or from the Fucked Four Alliance. Gay Men's domination of the endgame really had us wondering if it was enough to take home the gold, and even after a tie, it was. This was the first FTC in the org's history to really see a clash between the finalists for the Soul Survivor title, and it would pave the way for following seasons to show a ton of competition, because in my opinion, the past seasons never really showed as much competition as this season did. I think that the overall atmosphere of it being a blood versus water, as well as the stacked cast that we had really gotten, really made the season worthwhile and entertaining as a whole. For these reasons, this season gets a 4.5 out of 5 for entertainment. This might be a little bit of a controversial take, but I actually really like the twist of this season. It made the season very engaging, and it's one that wasn't busted by the players. It worked exactly as we intended. While there were some unbalanced abilities, most of them contributed a lot to the game and made the tribals a lot more intense. I don't actually think the Superman twist was that unbalanced. All it allowed for was basically a second life, and it was one use, so Redfine, who used that ability, got voted off like 2 tribals later. However, I can agree that Sasuke's Robin ability to boost other players' abilities should have had a cooldown. There were some other abilities that led to some pretty crazy tribals, though, such as Bilger's ability to give someone a fake idol, that way he gets a real one, or Joy's ability to cast 3 votes in a single tribal but have a self vote and the next tribal. What I found very interesting is that Game End actually ended up winning the season, and she never used her ability at all. And never really had to, because she was either close to the Majorca people, mostly with Rose and Emma, or she was winning immunities. One thing that was interesting was Green Arrow shooting at the other tribe to weaken their challenge score, while Poison Ivy's ability canceled it out. I just thought that was funny. The twist had a pretty decent impact on the season overall, and although it could have used some adjustments, for the most part, it was a really good twist that really changed the way how people play. So I think it's fair to give this twist a pretty good 4 out of 5. I think this season is just straight up extremely memorable, not gonna lie. While this isn't directly related to how the season went, I'd be damned if I didn't mention that this season wasn't the season that truly kickstarted the org with 70 plus applications. I'd argue that it allowed the org to be seen by a ton of newer players, which would help us for future seasons and ultimately make the org much more well known. I think that this season being as entertaining and successful as it was also definitely helped. This season had a ton of great gameplay, great moments, great tribals, and a great cast to top it off with. Even with a slightly unbalanced twist, people made sure to make it really good, even despite the cracks and flaws with some of it. I didn't think that this season was going to be topped anytime soon at the time of the season originally finishing, but 2 seasons have done that since then, which I think is insanely difficult given this season's rating of an impressive 9 out of 10. Our runner-up is our fans versus flops versus favorite season, Season 8, Pirates of the Caribbean. This season's winner was funky, with host favorites being Hayden, Clay, and SS, the latter of which was also the fan favorite. Season 8 was actually a lot of fun to set up. We got some new hosts that were much more active, we practiced the challenges well before the season started, and we had a lot of hype coming from how active Season 5 through Season 7 were. Only thing that remained is how Season 8 will deliver. Not only did Season 8 blow our previous seasons out of the water, no pun intended, but all the other seasons as well. The cast, twist, activity, and story made the season way better than we expected, and there were many great moments in Season 8. The activity did end up being really high this season. While the activity wasn't like absurdly high in Season 5, the activity was very consistent. There were almost no inactive players in the season aside from like a few who may not have been as active as everyone else, but not inherently inactive per se. The first few boots of the season were actually pretty good, and some of them you could argue were pretty robbed. Everyone did pretty well in the merge too. Almost all of the returnees who made the merge played way better than their previous seasons. There's not a whole lot to say about the activity that hasn't already been said about other seasons, but yeah, there were little flaws in the activity, and everyone used their confessional and alliances. So for that, I'm going to give the activity a nice 4.5 out of 5. The gameplay was so fun to watch. Not only were there an insane amount of moves in the merge, but also the pre-merge as well. The Arrow and Flogcarf tribals were mostly pretty straightforward, but the game really came into action starting at the Felix tribal, where Seamus, Clay, and Napalm all went for Felix. And then a joint tribal happened, which was really funny. Napalm and Aura got into a fight, and then I guess Napalm wanted to go for Yuna, and then he went for Pi, which sent Napalm home 11 to 6 to 1. Due to Aura really wanting to save Yuna, Aura ended up also getting targeted the next tribal. After Napalm went, more and more people were going for the Fans tribe, so SS publicly announced that Seamus was gonna play his idol to save him. So the favorites tried to split votes on Seamus and Vinny, but that ended up resulting in the fans and flops successfully voting Colin out. This and Swap put the favorites in a really bad position, especially Funky, who is basically swap fucked. But because Hayden knew that Funky would be an easy boot, he voted off Artemis instead because he saw Artemis as a bigger threat than Funky. And then Hayden threw the next challenge to vote off Funky. One thing I didn't mention until now was that the twist was Redemption Island. So Funky ended up making his way back into the game later, hence why he won, but more on that later. After Cameron and Arrow were voted off unanimously, next up was not only the first official tie vote, but also one of the best moves in the season, Vinny's boot. Basically, Seamus used his odd idol to negate his votes, but then Hayden, who had one vote on Seamus already, put his other 2 votes on Vinny with his powerful papyrus, which he got from the island twist. So that put the tie between Lily and Vinny. This forced SS, who voted in the minority voting David, to flip and vote Vinny out of the game. Funky then came back into the game, and Gumball was voted off very early into the merge where Hayden idled him out. But then Gumball came back at the final 7. Hayden got voted off at the final 9 for a split vote between him and Derek. But because Hayden was a big threat, Clay and Seamus flipped to vote him off. After 2 more split votes with Clay and Pi being voted off, we had the infamous October 11th, 2022, the one day where so much happened for season 8. We went from the final 6 to a final 2 in a single day. Derek got voted off 3.5 votes to 1. Lily used Jack's Cutlass to cut 3 of the votes in half. Then, when SS was going to vote Funky, Funky won immunity and got Gumball to flip on SS at the final 5. And because Seamus had 3 abstains and 2 strikes due to the abstains, 1 more abstain would remove him from the game. So he struck a deal with Funky to vote off Lily so that Funky could get to FTC, where Seamus abstained for the final time and got 3rd. Season 8 had so much gameplay, so many crazy moves that made vast changes to the majority of the game. So for that, the gameplay of the season gets a perfect 5 out of 5. It goes without saying that this cast was really good. It was a flops versus favorites versus fans season, and the favorites were all very well-known names by the time the org started, especially people like Funky, Derek, Colin, and Pi. We also had the flops, a tribe of people who either got an early boot for the wrong reasons or didn't do well late in the merge, so we wanted to see them again. Some of the players who improved most from their previous seasons were Hayden and David. We also had a pretty okay fans tribe that had SS and Clay, even though half of the tribe got eliminated very early. All the names were pretty well known, some of which even applied to previous seasons and were noteworthy from other orgs that happened recently, such as Felix, who hosts Fanviver, and Fuggles, who is a co-host of Dementsorg. All in all, this cast was really good. Everyone was decently active, and it was fairly chill, for the most part, aside from someone who we don't talk about. Anyways, this cast was pretty great, so I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. I think this season has a very coherent story. In the pre-merge, you had the likes of David, Hayden, and Artemis completely controlling the Flops tribe, Napalm and Clay controlling the Fans tribe, and the Favors tribe just being one big happy family. The joint tribals would prove to be a great sense of rise and fall for the likes of both Napalm and Colin, who would both get knocked out back-to-back at those tribals, only allowing for the power of Hayden, David, and Artemis to increase while in the background. SS and Clay were only beginning their story after the decimation of the fans. At Swap, Hayden would get insanely greedy with power and would flip on Artemis to work with the fans, which would continue into him lying to David about what happened at the next swap. Hayden would then flip again to help the fans in leaking David's advantage and causing the first ever tie in the history of the org to this point, being a fucking whopping 2-2 to 2-1 vote at the final 12, leading SS to flip on Vinny. At the merge, Hayden was feared by the likes of many people, including Funky, who had been a previous victim of his as he returned from Dead Man's Cove. Hayden would use the idol that he found to idle out Gumball right after the merge began. This would definitely show Hayden as a huge and very obvious villain at this point. After an immunity win, the villain would be slain after yet another tie at the final 8, with Clay and Seamus flipping on him. However, in the background, you had SS and Clay flipping back and forth a ton to cement them in good spots as well, leading them to become the bigger threats alongside Funky once the villain in Hayden was completely gone. This would lead to the blind sides of Clay, Pi, and SS shortly after due to Funky's strong immunity run and Gumball's return from Dead Man's Cove. After the Flipper story had ended, you had Funky's story. Getting swap screwed to joining Dead Man's Cove to getting voted back into the game, navigating the early merge well, becoming a target, and winning out to the end is definitely one hell of a roller coaster. This season's story for him was a lot of trial and error, and he really got to put that on full display at FTC, netting him the win at the end. I think this story was really good, but it did have some segments where it was entirely focused on one player, that mainly being Hayden. In my opinion, not letting a whole ton of other players get the spotlight. However, Funky's story, alongside many others, definitely makes the season feel coherent as a whole, and for that reason, the story in this season gets a solid 5 out of 5. It goes without saying that hasn't already been said that this is one of the most entertaining seasons we've had in a long time. Coming out right out of an extremely frustrating season 7, a much more entertaining season was needed for us as the hosts. Luckily, it delivered so well to the point where we've had the best tribals we've ever had. The Napalm tribal was really funny because after Felix getting out due to a metagame, Napalm and Aura had a fight, and Napalm wanted to go for Yuna, I guess because of a previous challenge, but Aura didn't want that, so Napalm went home 11-6-1 in a really chaotic and funny tribal where he just completely blew up his game. El Bozo. We also had some really fun tribals, most of which were orchestrated by Hayden, where he got Artemis out because he saw Artemis as a bigger threat, and then he used his powerful papyrus he got from the Island Twist after Seamus used his odd idol, so he casted 2 votes on Vinny, tying the vote between Vinny and Lily, forcing SS to flip on Vinny, one of his allies. Nobody will forget October 11th, 2022, though. That was the one day where we speed ran the tribals from rounds final 6 all the way to final 2. The tribals that day were quick. Final 6 started the day before and ended on October 11th, respectively. Final 5's tribal only took an hour. Final 4's tribal only took 10 minutes. And Seamus pulled himself from the game at final 3. So we had a pretty fast game at the start. It became a little longer during the middle, but at the end, it went so fast. There was so much going on that day. It also helps that FTC was really good. It was between Funky and Gumball, who both played really good and actually came back from Redemption Island. Both of them had well-made FTC speeches and good responses to their questions. But in the end, Funky managed to secure his win against Gumball 6-2. This was a pretty great season from start to finish. There was never a dull moment to be found that hurt the season one bit. So for that, the entertainment gets a 5 out of 5. This season had 2 twists, both of which were great and had a pretty major impact on the game. Basically, there was this twist called Island Quest, where everyone had to vote for a captain to go to an island. These islands either had a challenge where like if you beat it, you get an item, whether it's an advantage or a disadvantage, or there were some decoy islands that had nothing. Every round minus the first, there was either a high tide where you could only go to islands with a red number, a low tide where you could only go to islands with a blue number, while green numbered islands were always available, both for high tides and low tides. Some examples included odd and even idols, which only worked at odd or even numbered tribals respectively. Jack's Cutlass, where you could cut 3 votes in half. The Powerful Papyrus, which gave you 2 extra votes. Or the Cursed Die, which you had a 50-50 chance for either an idol or 2 self-votes. Not all of the advantages were found, though, but all the ones that I just mentioned that were found made a pretty big impact on the game and made the tribals they were used at a lot more interesting. We also brought back Redemption Island, which was originally a twist in Season 4, but this time, instead of basing it off of challenges, we had it so that the players would vote each other back in. Also, unlike Season 4, where all the players who came back in didn't really make too big of an impact on the season, Season 8, Funky came back and literally won the season, as well as Gumball, who became the runner-up. All in all, this twist is one of the better twists we've ever had, and it directly changed the course of the season, so I think it's fair to give the season's twist a perfect 5 out of 5. Overall, this season was absolutely amazing. Everything was great. The cast was great. The gameplay was great. The twist was great. I loved almost everything about this season. It far surpassed our expectations, and it was the season, at least to me, that hosting became fun again. After some of the issues with Season 5, Season 6, and Season 7 increasing exponentially with each season, Season 8 really felt like a return to form. It was the chill season we had in Season 4, but done miles better. It was way more entertaining, and there was never a dull moment from the players. And even the ones we got out earlier were really good too. I had so much fun watching the season. I have little to no issues with it. And I think it's fair that this season, without a doubt, deserves an outstanding 9.7 out of 10.
Coming in at number 1, which shouldn't be a huge surprise, is Season 10, Majora's Mask. This season's winner was Heki, and the host favorites were Heki and Cyber, while the fan favorite of the season was Mello. After just finishing up Season 9, hopes were extremely high for a great Season 10, especially considering we had decided to rebrand from doing only movies under the title of VisuORGs to doing movies, games, and shows under the new title of VisuORGs. I had personally been planning the season since August of 2022 behind the scenes, as well as wanting to host the season by myself as a way to say thank you to everyone for 9 seasons of the org leading up to that point. I gave back to everyone, and everyone sure as fucking hell gave me a fucking phenomenal season back. Starting off with activity, it was very clear that this cast knew that the season stakes were extraordinarily high, and that activity was a priority. Even those like Creamy, Diego, Cam, and Evan were all fairly active at different times, even if they weren't as active as others. For the rest of the cast, they were all talking consistently and made active efforts to socialize and be present in this season, and that's not something I can say about any season leading up to this point, considering there's always been something that's knocked the score down in this category. However, I really saw no huge flaws in the activity this season, and that is backed up by the fact that I wasn't able to call anyone necessarily inactive on anyone's player rankings. For these reasons, I can easily give the activity a 5 out of 5. The gameplay in this season was extremely fun to watch. The mask twist most definitely had players bending around them to try to put themselves in the best spot possible, but more on that when we get to the twist section. The gameplay was fairly straightforward on the starting tribes, but I'd argue that the moves started to skyrocket at the first swap. The swaps had the tribes divided into tribes of 5 or 4 depending on the swap, leading to a lot of plays being made. Starting off at the first swap, we had Yoshi's Blindside with Mello, Harmony, and Jacoby all being part of that while lying about their masks, leading to an extremely close 3 to 2.5 vote. Later that swap, we had Dean and Evan try to control the swap tribe, only for Marissa to completely thwart them in Evan's boot with a 2 to 1.5 vote while saving Chase. Shortly after that, we had Or's tribal, in which all the votes were negated by Deku's except for Kat's vote, which he had placed solely on Or, leading Or to go 0.5 to 0. On the second swap, Cat would prove to be in a strong spot as they once again decide on a tribal council with their sole vote on Lizard, sending Lizard out 1-0. Then on the third swap came the triple elimination, where bonds would truly be decided between those on the tribes of 4, with Dean and Amethyst getting sniped due to their lack of strong connections and Jacoby getting sniped for having too many connections. This would lead us into the merge, where most of the gameplay would continue to stay strong. Cat would get voted off for controlling most of the pre-merge, even though they could have saved themselves by actually playing their heart pieces. This tribal also had its fair share of arguments, with Cyber and Chase having a whole ordeal on whether Cat should stay or go, and if that would be good for their games. This would lead to Chase's boot immediately after Cat went, as people feared his social standing with everyone left. After that, Funky met with the same deadly fate that Orr had previously, with Hecky being the sole vote this time around to send him packing 0.5-0. Mellow and Harmony would then play the Goron's Lullaby and force rocks, leading Harmony to get rocked out, screwing Mellow right afterwards. Hecky would convince Maddie to go for Marissa, leading Maddie to convince Cyber to go for Marissa when Hecky easily should have been the one going home. Final Tribal Council was a clash of Hecky's stellar under-the-radar game and Cyber's flashier game. Final Tribal Council would tie in a 4-4-1 vote, with Maddie giving Hecky the win. You can't fucking tell me that the gameplay this season wasn't packed at every single moment of the game, leading to a ton of robberies from a lot of the very good players. When a lot of the moments and moves this season can be remembered easily, that's when you know the gameplay is amazing. For obvious reasons, the gameplay this season gets a 5 out of 5. The cast this season honestly was the most stacked cast I've seen in the org to date, and that's saying a lot considering Season 5, Season 8, and Season 9 are still insanely high up on this list. I knew that from the sheer amount of applications that I had gotten for this season, which actually almost broke Season 5's record of 75 by getting 64 this time around, that this cast was going to be no joke, and no joke it was. I could honestly say that everyone in this cast was notable in one way or another. Yes, even Bobby. Just not for the right reasons. You had the big names in Funky, Mellow, Cyber, Amethyst, Lizard, Dallas, Marissa, Orr, and Mina coming in from past seasons of the org having done fairly well in their own respective rights. And then Kat, Creamy, Cam, Harmony, Yoshi, and Zoe all being recognizable names coming into the org for the very first time. It's funny how Hecky, being someone who nobody had known beforehand, would come in and win, but I digress. This cast knew what everyone else was capable of doing with a variety of different game styles, and even those that weren't as known like Chase, Evan, and Hecky all stepped up to the plate to really make their name known in the season. Although it did result in some negativity towards the end with certain jurors, not naming names, it didn't ultimately impact anything huge with the gameplay the players presented, and it gave us an extremely solid winner at the end of the day. Everyone in this cast gave it what they had in them, and I can honestly respect that a ton at the end of the day, since it resulted in an extremely memorable and entertaining cast, helping make the season even better. For those reasons, this season's cast gets a perfect 5 out of 5. This season really had a story all throughout the season, not gonna lie. You had two different stories starting off on each of the starting tribes, with Orr and Hecky's rise to power on Snowhead, with Cat's rise to power on Woodfall, and also the beginnings of TNT Family. While Orr's part of the story would crumble quickly at the second tribal of the season, Hecky's story would continue to stay strong throughout the entire season, ultimately navigating behind the scenes as the background character that people knew was going to pop out last second, and that's exactly what would happen. Cat's story would be prevalent in the number of tribals they would attend and completely control, leading their story to come to the end at the merge with their elimination. At the merge, Hecky's, Cyber, Mellow, and Harmony stories would emerge, and that would be 100% clear with the immediate removal of Cat, Chase, and Funky with their respective boots. I honestly feel like you could sum up the endgame as these four players clashing for the title of sole survivor. You had Harmony and Mellow working together, Cyber and Hecky working together, and then Hecky flipping back and forth between the two sides. Ultimately, Harmony and Mellow would crumble at the final 6 and final 5, leaving Hecky and Cyber to duel it out. Ultimately, Hecky would gain the upper hand at the final 4 with Marissa's boot, and then the two would duke it out at Final Tribal Council. And what story would this be if Final Tribal Council didn't initially tie? That's just what would happen, leaving Maddie to decide the winner. Much like any time in the season, when one story ends, another begins or continues. This would be prominent in Cyber's narrow loss to Hecky after Maddie's vote for Hecky, leading Hecky to become the winner that nobody would have ever thought of on day one. Hecky went from being the outsider of the org on day 1 to being the winner of the most competitive season of the org to date on day 38. I truly think that the season story is insanely well put together and coherent, and for that reason, I give it a perfect 5 out of 5. This season was immensely entertaining in all different aspects. The cast provided some great confessionals and great gameplay at every possible moment in my opinion. Even the non-game stuff like TNT Family playing TNT Tag was very enjoyable and honestly makes the early season very memorable amidst the straightforward boots. As a host, I loved watching all these swaps happen. Evan's Tribal was very exciting to reveal, and Or's Tribal low-key made me a little sad since his fate was decided in less than 30 minutes. Lizard's Tribal was also very exciting to reveal as it showed Cat's control over the pre-merge of the season. The triple elimination that followed was also very memorable for me since everyone on the cast and the spectators were pretty mad at me for doing it, but it just made it all the better for me as a host. I loved this merge. You had different journeys from each and every person in the final 9 leading up to this point coming to clash in the endgame. It almost felt like a roller coaster, to be honest. You had Cat's reign of tyranny from the pre-merge and instantly followed up by Chase's struggle strategically biting him in the ass. Funky's Tribal was Or's Tribal but magnified, as I was always wondering if it was going to be someone having half a vote to send someone packing or if it was going to be a 0-vote Tribal. Ultimately, Hecky's social standing would allow him to get Funky to bite the bullet. And it does not stop there. Mello and Harmony would both force rocks in an attempt to get Cyber or one of the people against them out in a 20% rock draw chance, only for that to backfire on the very first rock drawn being purple, sending Harmony packing. This would lead to a very straightforward boot in Mello right after, but the final four somehow was extremely entertaining. The target always kept shifting from Hecky to Maddie, but then it landed on Marissa due to Hecky's strong social game with Maddie. This season's final tribal council was just wow. It was being played by all of the finalists. Even Maddie was trying her ass off, even if she stood no chance at winning. Arguments and compromises were being made about games. The jurors were giving extremely good questions for the finalists, and the result was just the perfect way to cap it off, with Final Tribal Council tying it first, leading Hecky to win with Maddie's vote. I never genuinely thought I'd see a Final Tribal Council top Season 6's Final Tribal Council, but here we are. The reunion and Final Tribal Council were just extremely memorable, and I loved reading each and every single vote out to get a ton of reactions from people in the VC, with people constantly saying, there's no way it ties again. This season was just so entertaining to host, and because of it, it makes it very memorable to look back on, giving this season a perfect 5 out of 5 for entertainment. The twists. I get to talk about this one a lot. The core twist revolved around Majora's Mask's 3 core masks, the Deku Mask, the Goron Mask, and the Zora Mask. Each mask has an ability alongside the mask for the players to use in the case that they went to Tribal Council. The Deku Mask had half a vote, but it could pop somebody else's vote in return. The Zora Mask had 2 votes due to the charged magic meter, but couldn't vote at the next Tribal Council. The Goron Mask allowed the user to punch a parchment, revealing the person who made it, but also had the ability to reverse the parchment back onto the user. Considering I never genuinely told anyone the chances, I'll say it now in this ranking. It was a 3 out of 6 chance for the user to not hit anything, a 2 out of 6 chance for the user to stumble and miss their punch, and a 1 out of 6 chance for the punch to successfully reverse the parchment. I do think that everything was extremely balanced in terms of the mask, and it made for the players to need to adjust and find new strategies with the masks, and admittedly, a loophole was found with losing the player's vote at the next tribal with the Zora Mask, and then reversing with the Goron Mask knowing that the player couldn't lose their vote, since, well, it was already gone. The players were also only allowed to use the masks once unless they had used the other ones, making the choices more crucial than ever. The mask made for a ton of good moves, which I have already explained above, so I thoroughly believe that it was a super solid twist overall and made for great gameplay. There was also the twist of the moon plummeting into Termina, in which the players would need to play the Song of Time in order to revert the moon back to its initial stage on day 1. If the moon were to plummet, the Mask and Ocarina songs would be removed from the game entirely. Speaking of the Ocarina, that's the third twist. The Ocarina allowed the players to play the song that Link would have inside the game, and if the players could find the melodies hidden around the server, they could play them for themselves. I only hid 2, that being the Song of Double Time and Goron Lullaby, in which both were used in successive fashion, with Harmony using the Song of Double Time to lead the final 7 Tribal Council, and after being given the melody by Harmony, Mello played the Goron Lullaby to force rocks, with Harmony ironically getting rocked out at the final 6. Lastly, the heart pieces. These were smaller advantages that would negate a single vote on the player that it was used on. While these weren't as successful as the Masks and the Melodies, they did make for people to use them as a whole, even if there were a few misplays. Notably, Dean, Kat, Mina, and Cyber all blowing their pieces, and Kat straight up not playing them when he literally was the main target to go home. However, I still think they made for safe plays considering all the smaller tribes in this season. I love this twist immensely, and I do think it was executed very well as a whole. It did make the game a bit more complicated and tedious, but not to the point where strategies were hindered, and if anything, it encouraged moves to be made considering what the Masks and the Melodies had in store. While I do think some of the loopholes could have been patched, I do admire the creativity the players had when coming up with them, so I don't see it as a flaw. I think this twist 100% gets a solid 5 out of 5, and I think that it also made the season extremely enjoyable. Overall, this season was just fucking phenomenal. I loved every single aspect about how this season went, from the twist, to the cast, to the gameplay, to the result. I think everything went perfectly. You can disagree with me on this, but this season is 100% a season that people will remember fondly and recall every time someone either mentions it or asks a question about it. I really think that this season was a great start to the rebrand of the org as a whole, and really continues to motivate me as a host to continue to have great seasons even past this one. It was so much fun not only watching this cast play through my borderline insane ideas that I had planned, but also interacting and seeing their reactions throughout the entire season. Even though I was the only host for this one this time around, I have to thank everyone involved for making it as clean and smooth as possible, and it really could not have been done without the stellar cast and their gameplay. Without a fucking doubt, this season gets the first ever perfect 10 out of 10. Overall, both Amy and I truly thank you all for the first 10 seasons of the org. We never thought that a simple idea back in 2021, like VisuORGs at first, and now VisuORGs, would ever get this far. It's thanks to all of you that have either played in the season or supported the org as it grew over the course of nearly 2 years. You gave your time and effort to us, and we always want to make sure that we're able to give that back to you as well. So we hope that this video was not only a good deep dive into each of our seasons so far, but also a good proper ranking of all of them. We hope that you enjoyed the video, and once again, we thank you all for everything.